Los Angeles in the late 1980s was a place where many young talents sought to break into the world of show business, dreaming of fame and recognition. The little actress Judith Barsi was born and grew up in this bustling metropolis. She was born on June 6, 1978, in the family of Hungarian immigrants Maria and Jozsef Barsi, who came to the United States in the hope of a better life. Judith's parents were people of modest means, but their daughter's talent and charisma seemed to promise to change their fate. Judith started her career in Hollywood very early. At the age of 5, she became the face of many advertising campaigns and soon got roles in popular television series and movies. Her acting career quickly took off. Judith starred with famous actors, and her bright smile and charming appearance attracted the attention of both viewers and directors. Her most notable work was the role of Ducky, a cheerful and friendly character from the cult animated film Earth Before the Beginning of Time. Her voice, filled with cheerfulness and childlike energy, was remembered by millions of viewers around the world. In the eyes of the public, Judith was the epitome of a successful young star. Everything seemed perfect. She appeared in famous films, voiced characters that many children and adults loved, and provided for the family, bringing significant income to the house. During the years when Judith was at the peak of her career, the income from her work allowed the Barsi family to improve their living conditions, and they moved into a large house in an upscale Los Angeles area. For many, it seemed that the Barsi family had achieved their dream, but, as often happens, behind the external well-being there was another gloomy side of the life of this family. Judith's father, Jozsef Barsi, could not cope with the psychological pressure and his addiction to alcohol. Jozsef suffered from constant bouts of rage, which became more and more frequent. Others noticed that the man was withdrawn, aggressive, and easily lost his temper. Behind his harmless smile was a man who suffered from deep internal conflicts, which manifested themselves in the abuse of his family. Maria, Judith's mother, also came from Hungary. She worked in a restaurant where she met Jozsef. At first, their relationship seemed normal, and when their daughter was born, it seemed like they had a new beginning. However, every year Jozsef's behavior became more aggressive and unpredictable. He abused alcohol and often threatened Maria and Judith with physical violence. Despite this, Maria did not dare to leave her husband for a long time. Fear for her own life and her daughter's life held her down, forcing her to stay in this dangerous marriage. The neighbors of the Barsi family repeatedly heard screams and quarrels from their house. Judith's mother tried to hide family problems, not wanting to advertise what was happening. Sometimes she turned to friends for help, but they could only guess how serious the situation in the family was. Once Maria even went to the police, saying that her husband was threatening to kill her, but after another apology and promises from Jozsef, she decided not to bring the case to court, hoping that he would be able to change his behavior. At the same time, Judith continued to act in films and work in advertising, maintaining the image of a cheerful and cheerful girl in public. However, behind this external image, there was a deep fear and constant tension. Close colleagues noted that the girl began to show signs of nervous disorders. She stopped growing despite her age and started having tantrums on set. Later, doctors determined that the cause of this was stress caused by the family situation. However, this did not attract proper attention from social services or doctors. Jozsef Barsi was a man who was very jealous of his daughter's success. He felt unnecessary and superfluous in her life, seeing how his little daughter became the center of attention and provided for the family. This jealousy and resentment only intensified his aggressive behavior. He often threatened his wife and daughter, saying that he would kill them both if they decided to leave him. Maria tried to calm him down, believing that she could find a way out of the situation, but, alas, these threats turned out to be not empty words. A few weeks before the tragedy, Maria finally decided to leave her husband. She began planning an escape and was looking for a new place to live, hoping to save herself and her daughter from constant fear. But Jozsef, feeling that control over his family was slipping out of his hands, became even more unpredictable. A tragic ending was inevitable. Despite warnings and visible signs of danger, no one was able to prevent the disaster. Neighbors recalled that in the last month before the tragedy, the tension in Barsi's house became especially noticeable. Noisy quarrels, shouting, and constant threats from Jozsef have become the norm, but none of those around him realized that this could lead to murder. In July 1988, a terrible tragedy overtook the Barsi family, putting an end to the life of Judith and her mother. Their lives, filled with fear and violence, ended in one moment, leaving behind not only the bitterness of loss, but also many questions that will remain unanswered. The summer of 1988 in Los Angeles promised nothing unusual. Peace and quiet reigned in the Canoga Park area where the Barsi family's house was located. It was one of those areas where residents were used to a measured life and rarely noticed anything beyond the ordinary. However, the morning of July 27th, 1988, changed this routine. Early in the morning, the police station received an alarm call from a neighbor who reported strange noises coming from Barsi's house on Felton Avenue. He was agitated. He thought he heard gunshots. The area was quiet, and the locals rarely encountered anything that could disturb their peace of mind. A neighbor of the Barsi family, known as Mr. Donaldson, had been hearing periodic screams and quarrels in the house opposite for several months. According to him, quarrels in this family happened often, especially in the evenings, but lately the noise and tension have increased. However, that morning the sounds were not just screams. They were sharp, like thuds, which instantly led Donaldson to believe that something terrible had happened. A police team immediately went to the scene. When the officers arrived at the house, everything seemed normal. A beautiful house with a manicured lawn, surrounded by a high fence, was typical of this prestigious area. However, no one responded to the knock on the door, and the police decided to act. They went around the house, trying to find a way to get inside. Fortunately, the back door of the house was unlocked. The officers entered the house and soon found themselves face to face with the horror that lurked behind the exterior facade of a quiet life. From the very first step into the house, the police felt a heaviness, as if the air had become denser. Everything was neat inside: furniture, paintings on the walls, photographs on the shelves, toys in the corner. All this created the illusion of an ordinary family life. However, soon, as they moved through the house, the officers began to smell the smell, which became stronger with each step. It was the sharp, bitter smell of death, which could not be confused with anything else. The hearts of the police constricted when they realized that something irreparable had happened. The police found the bodies in the bedroom on the second floor. At first, their gaze fell on the bed. 48-year-old Maria Barsi was lying there, without signs of life. There were obvious signs of a gunshot wound on her body, and it could be seen that death occurred instantly. Her face, previously beautiful and full of life, was now disfigured by the horror of the last moments of her existence. She probably didn't even have time to figure out what happened when the killer fired his fatal shot. The silence of the room only intensified the tragedy of this scene. However, the real horror was revealed when officers discovered the body of 10-year-old Judith. Her small body was lying next to her mother's bed, and one look at her made it clear that she was also the victim of a cold and inhuman act of violence. Judith also had a gunshot wound to the head, and experts would later determine that the girl's death was instantaneous, just like her mother's. The bodies lay in silence with no signs of a struggle, indicating that the victims had been shot while they were at rest, perhaps even in their sleep. Judith's room, located next door, turned out to be what one would expect from a 10-year-old girl. Toys and dolls were scattered there, and awards and mementos from the films she starred in were on the shelves. One of the toys, a stuffed dinosaur, lay on the bed, like a reminder of the character Judith voiced in the famous animated film, The Earth Before the Beginning of Time. This contrast between childish naivety and brutal murder made the scene even more heartbreaking. As it turned out later, the murder occurred during the night hours, when Maria and Judith were in their beds. There were no signs of a struggle in the room. This was a key factor indicating that the perpetrator had taken them by surprise, most likely when they were already asleep. The police were convinced that the shots were fired quickly, in cold blood, and with the aim of killing both women without a chance of escape. While the police searched the rooms on the second floor, they continued to search throughout the house, not knowing for sure what exactly awaits them ahead. It was only after going down to the first floor that they went out into the garage and came across another body. There, on the floor, with a gunshot wound to the head, lay 55-year-old Jozsef Barsi, the father and murderer. He was dressed in casual clothes, and next to him was an empty alcohol bottle and a .32 caliber revolver, the weapon that became the weapon of the crime. There was a half-empty pack of cigarettes on the table. Apparently, Jozsef first killed his wife and daughter in cold blood and then committed suicide, thus completing an act of violence that he probably had been harboring in his mind for a long time. For the police, this picture was familiar, but no less terrible. Family murders and suicides, unfortunately, were not uncommon, especially in cases where family relationships were poisoned by domestic violence for a long time. Additional evidence was found at the crime scene confirming that Jozsef had been hatching this plan for a long time. Among his personal belongings, letters and notes were found in which he expressed his jealous and aggressive thoughts, especially towards Maria, who, in his opinion, was going to leave him and take Judith with her. From further investigation, it became known that a few weeks before the tragedy, Maria Barsi really began planning an escape. She understood that the situation at home was becoming more and more dangerous, and she wanted to protect herself and her daughter. Documents were found in the house for renting an apartment in another area of Los Angeles, where Maria was going to start a new life. However, her attempt to escape was too late. Jozsef, who felt he was losing control of his family, could not bear the thought of his wife and daughter being able to live without him. This fact became a catalyst for him to put his monstrous plan into action. After a thorough examination of the crime scene, the police came to the conclusion that Jozsef had planned everything with cold calculation. The crime was not impulsive. It was thought out to the smallest detail. Neighbors and family friends recalled that Jozsef had repeatedly threatened his loved ones, especially after his alcohol addiction worsened, but no one believed that these threats could come true. However, this underestimation of his threats proved fatal. One of the most tragic moments in this story is that many people knew about the problems in the Barsi family, but no one was able to intervene in time. Neighbors said that Maria and Judith often looked depressed and scared, but they rarely talked about their personal lives, trying to keep problems behind closed doors. Many said that in the last weeks before the tragedy, Judith was seen crying or nervous on the street, but no one could have imagined that her life would be in such danger. Local social services also failed to respond to the alarm signals. At one time, Maria turned to law enforcement agencies for help when Jozsef threatened to kill her and Judith. But when it came to concrete actions, she was afraid of the consequences and decided to withdraw her statements. As is often the case in cases of domestic violence, fear and a sense of hopelessness drive the victim into a trap from which it is difficult to get out. Maria hoped to the last that she would be able to leave without bloodshed, but Jozsef did not give her such a chance. The house became a silent witness to the last days of Judith and Maria's lives. A lot of things reminded me of the joyful moments that Judith brought to this house, her career successes and warm relations with her mother. One of the most heartbreaking finds was made in Judith's room, where, in addition to her toys and personal belongings, the police found notes and drawings that she had made for her mother. On one of these notes it was written, "I love you, Mom," and there was a smiling flower painted next to it. These little pieces of childhood reminded Judith that, despite all the difficulties she had to face at home, she remained an ordinary child who dreamed of a better future. An important role in the tragic history of the Barsi family was played not only by the actions, but also by the inaction of those around them. The surrounding people knew about the domestic violence, but no one took decisive steps to intervene. Maria, living in constant fear for her life and the life of her daughter, tried to maintain the appearance of a normal life. Until the last moment, she continued to take Judith to filming and ensure her career, trying not to show others that terrible things were happening at home. Her resilience in the face of Jozsef's threats, as it turned out, played a fatal role. None of her colleagues and acquaintances knew how serious the situation was. Judith's colleagues also noted changes in her behavior in the last months of her life. Her teachers and supervisors on the set recalled that the girl became nervous, often crying for no apparent reason. In an interview with her colleague in the film The Earth Before the Beginning of Time, it was noted that Judith sometimes simply could not continue voice acting. She began to tremble and hid in a corner of the studio, afraid of someone or something, but never talked about her fears. Her emotional state was unstable, and she was clearly suffering from severe stress. Later, psychologists determined that these were clear signs of post-traumatic stress caused by constant violence on the part of the father. The police investigation revealed that Jozsef Barsi had been harboring his murderous intentions for a long time. His jealousy and sense of worthlessness, which intensified against the background of his daughter's success, led to the decision that if he could not control his family, then no one could. His sense of ownership of his wife and daughter, reinforced by long years of violence and alcoholism, became for him an excuse for murder. He repeatedly told friends and acquaintances that he would not let them leave, but those who heard these words did not perceive them as a real threat. It was only after the tragedy that it became clear how serious his intentions were. When the news of the murder of Judith and her mother reached the public, it caused a real shock. Domestic violence, the child protection system, and how such tragedies could have been prevented began to be discussed in the press and on television. Many fans of the films in which Judith starred were shocked that the little star, who voiced her favorite character Ducky, became a victim of such cruelty. One of the most tragic aspects of this case was that Judith was at the peak of her career, and she had a huge future. Producers and directors saw her as a talented actress who could become a big star, and her sudden death left a deep mark on the industry. Many of her colleagues on the set expressed their condolences, remembering Judith as an incredibly kind, talented, and always cheerful girl. In the tragic history of the Barsi family, there was no trial as such, since Jozsef Barsi committed suicide immediately after the murder of his wife and daughter. However, the investigation and its consequences caused a wide public outcry, and issues related to domestic violence and its prevention began to be discussed at various levels, from law enforcement agencies to organizations protecting the rights of victims. Even without the traditional judicial process, this case has become an important event that has forced a review of some aspects of the protection system for victims of domestic violence. After the investigation was completed, the case was officially closed as a murder and suicide. All the evidence gathered by the police clearly pointed to the guilt of Jozsef Barsi, and there were no other suspects or third-party participants in this case. Nevertheless, despite the absence of a trial, this case attracted the attention of the public and the authorities, in particular because of the many missed opportunities to prevent the tragedy. As numerous testimonies have shown, Maria Barsi tried several times to seek help from friends, relatives, and even the police. Her complaints of violence by her husband, as well as his threats to kill her and Judith, were recorded, but no serious action was taken. Social services also did not intervene, despite the fact that Judith, as a child, suffered from visible stress and had behavioral problems related to the home environment. This has led to a review of approaches to the investigation of cases of domestic violence and child protection. The public reaction to this case was extremely acute. Numerous articles in the press raised questions about why law enforcement and social services were unable to prevent the murder, despite clear signs of danger. Several publications in leading newspapers, such as the Los Angeles Times, emphasized that Maria's repeated complaints and her attempts to find a safe place for herself and her daughter did not lead to any action. Some journalists noted that in such situations, it is often the fear of the aggressor and the lack of confidence in help from the authorities that force victims of violence to remain in dangerous conditions. After this tragedy, authorities in Los Angeles and other cities began to seriously review existing measures to protect victims of domestic violence. One of the consequences was the tightening of the rules for responding to threats to life and health, especially when it came to children. New protocols have been introduced requiring a more thorough investigation of cases related to family conflicts, especially if the victims are women and children who have repeatedly complained of violence. At the same time, an active discussion began in public circles on how to improve the child protection system. Judith Barsi, being a talented actress and a well-known personality, has become a kind of symbol of unfulfilled hopes and a missed opportunity to prevent her death. Many fans of films with her participation, especially The Earth Before the Beginning of Time, were shocked to learn about the tragic fate of the girl, whose cheerful voice once sounded on cinema and TV screens. Petitions and appeals to the authorities began to appear on the internet, demanding to improve the system of protection of children and victims of domestic violence. Judith's colleagues from the film industry also expressed their shock and sorrow. The director of the animated film The Earth Before the Beginning of Time, Don Bluth, said in an interview that Judith was an incredibly talented and kind girl, and her death was a shock to the entire film crew. Bluth also noted that the film's crew was unaware of Judith's problems at home, although some members of the crew recalled that the girl was often nervous and cried while working, especially in the last months before her death. Of course, the tragedy of Barsi has become an important lesson for the entire film industry. Numerous producers and agents who worked with child actors began to reconsider their attitude towards young talents, paying more attention not only to their professional development, but also to their psychological state. Hollywood gradually began to realize that behind the successes on the screen, there may be personal tragedies that few people realize about. In addition to public and professional discussions, measures have been taken at the government level to strengthen child protection. Legislative initiatives related to domestic violence became stricter, and law enforcement agencies were required to intervene in the event of complaints, even if the victim did not want or could not continue the proceedings. This has improved the response to threats of violence and protected those who are afraid or shy to seek help. In addition, after the tragedy with the Barsi family, additional crisis centers for victims of domestic violence were opened in California. These centers became a place where women and children could seek emergency help and shelter in case of threat from their aggressors. Support and rehabilitation programs for victims of domestic violence have also increased, helping them recover both physically and psychologically. The case of Judith Barsi has left a deep mark not only in film culture, but also in the legislative sphere. Despite the fact that the murderer was not tried in the traditional sense, and there was no official trial, the very fact that the public, authorities, and social services were forced to reconsider their attitude to domestic violence can be considered an important outcome of this tragedy. As is often the case in domestic homicide cases, missed opportunities to intervene and rescue victims leave a deep wound in society. Judith Barsi's story has become a symbol that the protection system may not be effective enough if victims go unnoticed, or their complaints are not taken seriously. This case showed that even successful, famous people can suffer from violence behind closed doors, and reminded everyone of the importance of caring and timely intervention. Thus, although Jozsef Barsi was not brought to trial, his actions caused waves of discussion and changes in the public perception of domestic violence. This tragic event served as a reminder of the need to continue working to improve the protection system for women and children suffering from violence in order to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The house on Felton Avenue, where this terrible tragedy occurred, remained empty for a long time. Neighbors and locals avoided passing by it, as the atmosphere of horror and loss associated with this place was too strong. was only a few years later that the house was sold to new owners, but the memory of what happened outside its walls continued to live among those who knew the Barsi family. The tragic story of Judith Barsi is a sad reminder of how domestic violence can destroy lives despite outward well-being and success. Outwardly, Judith seemed like an ordinary happy girl, a talented actress with a successful career. Her voice, which sounded in films, left a mark on the hearts of millions of people, but outside the screens she lived in fear, hiding from the threats and violence that came from her own father. The house, which was supposed to be a place of comfort and safety, became the arena for Maria and Judith's long-term struggle for survival in conditions of constant stress and danger. Jozsef Barsi, their murderer and the head of the family, plunged into an abyss of jealousy, aggression, and alcoholism, which eventually led him to a terrifying decision: to destroy those whom he could not control. His jealousy of his daughter's success and fear of losing his family led to a brutal act of violence that could have been prevented if the domestic violence response system had worked in a timely manner. This case is a symbol of missed opportunities for intervention and inaction that cost the lives of innocent people. Despite the fact that Maria tried to leave her husband and looked for ways to protect herself and her daughter, she could not avoid the tragedy. Domestic violence is a problem that often goes unnoticed until it's too late. The memory of Judith lives on, not only through her films and roles, but also as a call to action to protect those who may find themselves in a similar situation. This case has become an important lesson for the whole society that indifference and inaction can cost lives, and that everyone has the right to a safe and violence-free existence.